the 100th anniversary of that event. And I found out to my dismay that I had missed her 150th birthday, which was February 27th. I found out in March something. But anyway, so it's her 150th year also. Just give you a quick description of who she was, for those of you who haven't been bored to tears by it already. I've been sort of obsessed with Alice Hamilton. I'm teaching the whole college class, and I'm teaching the entire thing on Alice Hamilton, so it's kind of all Alice Hamilton all the time, but anyway. She was a founder of industrial medicine, what we would call occupational health in this country. She really was one of the main people she became a world expert on lead poisoning. And she was, in addition to that, she was a physician. She was a social reformer who was deeply committed to the needs of working people. And that's really what leads her to the issue of occupational health. And she was a peace activist. She was one of the founders of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which is also 100 years old this year. And she was a fierce civil libertarian, which is one of the things I love most about her. She's just very, very clear-eyed about that coming out of the First World War that helped to clarify a lot of things because there were so many violations of civil liberties in the First World War. And she was also a prolific writer of clear and elegant prose. She wrote just, for someone who did so many other things, she really wrote constantly. She wrote letters back and forth to the family. And one of the things, one of her techniques was that she would write to her family first about something, and then if you look for it, you'll find it in Harper's Magazine or Atlantic Monthly, the next draft of it. When she went to occupied Belgium during the First World War, she wrote a 24-page letter to her family about it, which was really virtually the first draft. When she went to Russia in 1924, she wrote a 14-page letter to her family. Typescript, I'm happy to say, because she was terrible writing. But she really almost always got her hands on a typewriter, even in the Soviet Union. That's kind of who she is. I want to give you a little bit about her background. I will just say I came across her when I was the assistant director at the Hull House Museum back in the 1980s, and they didn't give me enough to do. So I read everything I could get my hands on, and one of the things was Alice Hamilton's autobiography, and then the letters and things. So she's been kind of a ghost on my shoulder for a lot of years now. She came from a family of considerable standing, I guess you'd say, in Fort Wayne, Indiana. They were, by the time her father got finished with the family fortunes, there weren't any anymore, but they had very high attitudes about their own standing. And she was educated at home by her parents in a somewhat devil-may-care way. I mean, they were very concerned that she know languages, and she learned the classics, and I think they were actually all well educated. Her sister is Edith Hamilton of Edith Hamilton's mythology. Yeah. So then, they were an intellectual crowd, but she decided pretty early on in her life that she thought she'd like to be a doctor. She didn't have a scrap of science, not a scrap of math, but she thought, well, if she was a doctor, she could be a missionary doctor and help people and travel. So that was it. That was really why she was sent as a young woman as a girl to Miss Porter's, I think it's really a finishing school, Miss Porter's school in Connecticut, which was kind of in keeping with their elite standing. I later found out that Jackie Kennedy went to Miss Porter's, so it was quite the place. But she said surely some of the worst teaching that had ever gone on anywhere went on at Miss Porter's, so she felt she was not a very well-educated person. But she announced to her family that she was going to be a doctor, and they were not at all pleased, because unlike the present time when physicians have considerable standing in society, That was really not true in the 19th century. She's coming into it just at the point where it's kind of the cusp of the new medicine, just as they're developing the idea of the germ theory of disease and antiseptic conditions. The physicians of the generation before her, most of them, really, you did better just sitting there suffering than going to a physician, and that was really almost literally true. They practiced every kind of heroic intervention minus antiseptic conditions that you could possibly imagine. And they also, dished out mercury and arsenic with abandon, and a lot of laudanum, a lot of opium. So, there were just very little controls. The typical training for a physician was to go to a school. Anybody could have set up a medical school. You just put out a shingle, basically. And the idea was that people would sit through the lectures for 2 years, the same lectures, and then they would go out and practice on people without ever having seen a patient often. So, you really were taking your life in your hands. This is when homeopathic medicine became so popular. And it was partly because at least they didn't harm you. They were using minuscule amounts of things, unlike these guys who are giving you opium and mercury. So it was not a profession of high standing, although it was, there were some people who were beginning to change it. But she stayed home and studied she got tutored in the sciences and went to, as she said, a fourth-rate medical school in Fort Wayne. And then she was admitted to the University of Michigan, which was one of the places it was modern in a couple of ways. One was that they were doing the new medicine, much influenced by Germany. But the other thing was that Michigan had been co-ed since 1870. And so when she went there, about a third of her class was women. And they actually went to classes with the men, and it was, it was pretty acceptable for women to be there. She really did very well there, and although she always, I think, really downplayed her abilities, but and then she interned briefly really for about a year in Minneapolis, and then went on to Boston. Then her Michigan mentors told her that she had to go to Germany, so off she went to Germany for a year. She ended up going to Germany 8 different times in her life, so she spoke fluent German. So, and by that time she concluded that she didn't really want to be a physician. She didn't want to be a medical practitioner. She said about, I don't know whether she continued to believe this, but this was a young doctor speaking, but she said, please don't call me a healer. She said, I feel like somebody watching a prize fight, and when they get better, I cheer them on, but I don't feel like I had anything to do with it. And then she said, and when they don't get better, I don't find them any less interesting. She does end up becoming a pathologist and a bacteriologist, so. But it's the science part that is fascinating. She really was very compassionate to her patients. I think part of what put her off about practicing medicine was the grim realities of it. But in any case, she went to Germany for a year. Then she came back and she went to Johns Hopkins, which was really the epicenter of the new medicine. She studied with William Osler. Does anybody know that name? He's one of the most famous.
Canadian.
He was Canadian, that's right. And he's the guy who said, students have to deal with patients. And that was such a revolutionary notion. But the whole group of them were just extraordinary people. And if you look at the development of modern medicine, she was there working with all of these people. But even despite that, it wasn't easy for her to find a job afterwards. And she said, well, there wasn't much call for pathologists, but of course being female was one of the things that clearly shaped her situation. But she did get a job at the Women's Medical School of Northwestern University in Chicago, and she was thrilled because she had heard Jane Addams of Hull House speak, and one of the things she wanted to do was to go and be a resident at Hull House. And so she was able to do that. She arrived in 1897 Hull House was the second settlement house established in the United States, and I think it was it was the most famous. She said at one point, when people would talk about Chicago, they'd say there are 3 major sites tourists have to see. The back of the yards, back of the yards, maybe it was the lake, and Hull House. Those were the things that everybody knew about. And that the idea of the settlement houses was, it was really very much in distinction from the kind of practicing charity of the time, or the common charity of the time. Charity at this point was very judgmental, very disapproving of the poor. I mean, the notion was that you would go down, it's really the beginning of casework. So in some ways it's an important thing, but they would send, as Jane Addams gently pointed out, they would send young women from the suburbs who had never worked a day in their lives to go down and give the message, you must work hard, you must save your money, just do not drink, do not be frivolous. And she went on to say, even though cleanliness is an impossible luxury, and saving money and not loaning money to your neighbor can mean the difference between life and death. Many people just didn't know very much about the circumstances of the people they were working with. The notion of the settlement house was that unlike people coming just in times of crisis and giving good advice, you actually lived in the neighborhood and you were neighbors, the phrase went, in good times and bad. And you rejoiced with your neighbors when there was something to rejoice about, and you hung in with them in hard times. And you recognized, and this was really one of the major principles, that yes, you were there doing good for them, but they in turn were reciprocating in all kinds of crucial ways. They were giving you friendship, they were giving you loyalty, they were giving you wisdom, they were giving you insight. And that was really a cardinal principle. It may have been Alice Hamilton who said it. Somebody said about Jane Addams, yeah, it was. The only thing she ever saw that could make her angry was when people tried to protect her from the neighbors, because she really understood that was her essence. I mean, she really needed to have that connection. So Alice Hamilton arrived. The night she arrived, they were entertaining the former governor Altgeld, who had been thrown out on his ear in 1896 for pardoning the Haymarket martyrs, these people who'd been executed in 1886. Anyway, I shouldn't get into that one. But it was she got introduced right away to the sort of radical element of Hull House. And she was, she really had a fairly rough time her first couple of years there. And I had a very hard time understanding this because I thought she struggled so much with, she had a job, she worked at, as they all did. They worked and they actually paid rent and everything for the privilege of, working then after hours. So she had this job that was a pretty interesting job. She was involved in all kinds of things, but she didn't feel that she could integrate the two parts of her life, and she was very, very uncomfortable about it. And I kept thinking, well, here you are, you're a physician at a settlement house. There you are, what more do you need? But she was a scientist. And she was more than anything, the physician's job, or the teaching job closed, the hospital closed. And she ended up getting a job at another laboratory. And it was, again, a very interesting thing. But she said the problem was to integrate pathology in Polk Street, which was one of the streets that ran next to Hull House. She really struggled with that. And for the first 10 years, although she was much more of an integral person than she gives herself credit for being. At one point, Jane Addams said, just don't do anything, just stay, So she really, she did make an impression. But what finally resolves her dilemma for her is this occupation of industrial medicine. And it's not uncommon. There are a number of other people, especially the women at Hull House, not exclusively, but because it was actually a co-ed place, but that they really kind of create jobs for themselves. I mean, there's so much shifting in this changing world, and she comes up with an occupation for herself. A number of her friend Julia Lathrop ends up being the first head of the Federal Children's Bureau, which is a brand new thing. You know, so it's not really an uncommon thing in a way, but it's neat to see it, you know, that. So what happens is that the governor appoints a committee, she's the only woman, as she always is, to investigate working conditions in Illinois, and especially, and they have exactly 1 year to do the study. She heads the study, and they don't know anything. They don't know which industries are poisonous. They don't know how they're going to get the information about who's been injured and who hasn't. The doctors in the various industries are almost all, they're company doctors, they're paid by the company, and their answer to everything is they drink, or they're Polish, or, you know, whatever. There's never an answer that is in behalf of the working population. So they had a team, a group of medical students and social workers, and they just turned, you know, everything they could upside down. They went into saloons and hospitals and went home to people's houses to interview them. And at one point, somebody went on strike, and that gave them an opportunity to interview everyone, because she knew she couldn't interview them. If you interviewed them at the factory, you know, you would get a pat answer. That's all there was to it. So anyway, it was a tremendously exciting year, and the Illinois survey was received, you know, very warmly. Probably the biggest problem they had in those early days was that Americans were so convinced that they were so far ahead of Europe that they didn't think there were any problems at all. And that's what they heard over and over. There are no problems here. And you know, these people who are young people who are dying of lead poisoning, or just, you know, hopelessly devastated by one kind of poisoning or another. So after the Illinois survey, which really made quite a splash, she was hired. She wasn't hired by the federal government. She worked out a deal with them where she would, I don't know why this sounds like such a great deal, but she loved it. It was the autonomy that was so important to her. She was asked by them to survey various industries for the federal government, much the way she'd done for the Illinois survey. And she wasn't paid at all. She didn't have any boss. Yeah, that's the part that I can't understand, because she didn't have a lot of personal wherewithal, you know, but only at the end did the federal government buy the report. But she didn't, she conceived it, she did all of the research, it was completely hers. And then at the end, they purchased it. And so I guess that would fund the next one. I don't know how she started out, but that made her very happy, and she worked with she continued to live at Hull House. She lived there for 22 years, but she traveled all around the country. Her autobiography is titled Exploring the Dangerous Trades, and she really did do that. I mean, there's one description of 1919, she went to the copper mines in Arizona, and she's describing, she was wearing, you know, a miner's uniform and one of those hats with a light on it, and they went plunging down 80 feet down into the mine. And she was walking across boards that were placed between, you know, chasms, and just that she would go off by herself, and they'd need to find, at one point she was trying to find a place to live, or not to live, but to stay, and this young man who was the assistant manager, he was the only one there, and he said, I would have you stay at our house, but my wife is gone, and I can't. And she said, I'm old enough to be your mother, it'll be fine. But she had the adventurous life she dreamed of as a child. During the war, she was like Jane Addams. She was against the war and was vocal about it, although she was a little more she was working for the federal government, so she was a little less vocal than Adams was. But both of them experienced a tremendous amount of pressure. It's interesting, though, I don't know how she did this, and this is something I have to find out, but she had a good boss, because despite the fact that the First World War allowed virtually no dissent, I mean, if you dissented, you were considered to be a traitor. And yet, they knew that she was a pacifist, and she was allowed, not allowed, I mean, her job was to inspect the munitions factories. So, you know, it's a real vote of confidence if you think about it. Also incredibly dangerous, because the factories were not, you know, great big things. They were all little, because they were afraid they were going to blow up, and you know, they kept them as small as possible. And some of them were just kind of fly-by-night setups, anyway. But during the war, she met David Edsel, who was a professor at Harvard on one of the many committees she was on in her life. And he was very taken with her. He was, at that point, there was only, I think, a Department of Public Health at Harvard, but he had ambitions, and they do end up having a school of public health, and he decided they needed someone in occupational health. So he persuaded the president of Harvard that this woman is distinguished, and we've got to have her. And by this time, she was considered, I think, really the world expert on lead poisoning. And he said, so the president, I think it was President Lowell, anyway, he said, well, I guess we'll have to have her if she really is the best in the business or whatever. So they decided that they would bring on Alice Hamilton. And I'll tell you more about what else goes on in her that year, 1919, but I want to do the Harvard part first. So the reaction, Harvard was, you know, you think about Harvard now, I think you'd think of it as a liberal institution, right? But that was certainly not the Harvard of 1919. They were really proud of being as stuck in the mud as they could possibly be. And most other schools, many other schools by that time had either women professors or had admitted women. Harvard admitted Alice Hamilton in 1919. They didn't admit women students till 1945. So they were determined, you know. And when when her appointment was announced, the press, I think the New York Post or somebody said, "The Citadel has fallen." And I thought, well, no, it wobbled, because they didn't let women students in for a long time. But, and they asked Alice Hamilton what she thought, and she said, "I may be the first woman professor at Harvard, but I'm not the first woman who should have been a professor at Harvard." So she was characteristically both modest and ironic about it. But the male professors, not all of them, but some of them were very exercised about three things. One was they wanted to be sure that she didn't think she could eat in the faculty dining room. That was a very great concern. I don't know what they thought was going to happen if she did. But that was one thing. And another thing was she could not have football tickets. That was apparently a major thing. Then the third thing is, she described it every year, she would get an invitation to graduation, and the faculty sat on the platform, and she'd get an invitation to graduation, and then handwritten it would say, "No woman must ever sit at the platform." And so she skipped graduation every year. She said, which I thought was tactless, but probably not malicious or something. But, so that was their concern. Her concern, she had some terms also, and one of them was that she only wanted to work fall semester, we would say, because she was really concerned. She wanted to stay connected to Hull House, and the other thing was she wanted to do research. And you know, as I look at it, I think, you telling me Harvard couldn't spring for research for this person? But they didn't. And it may be that she also wanted the autonomy of it. It meant that she really always was concerned about money. You know, she was always looking for another gig somewhere, because she really needed to supplement her income. And once the 1920s rolled around, more conservative time in American history, Warren G. Harding dropped her from the federal survey. He didn't want anything surveyed, apparently, so that job went out the window, and I'll tell you where her next job comes from, but she wanted that time. And one of the other things that she doesn't say, but pretty early on she establishes, is that she has another life, and that is her life as a social reformer, as a peace activist, as a thinker, as a writer, and she's not prepared to stop that just because Harvard is going to be upset about it. But she's very diplomatic about the whole thing. But in the time that she was at Harvard, she never rose above assistant professor. Now, some of that might be because she only taught half-time, but I mean, she was world-renowned. You know, it just, only they sort of missed the point, it would seem. And part of the thing was not only that she was female, it was also her field, which they felt was too practical, and I suspect too working class. I mean, I'm sure there was a class element to it, you know, and they liked things that were more theoretical. Heaven forbid you should be useful in a medical school, right? It's just, so, but in any case, she never did rise above the level of assistant professor. I don't know that it mattered a great deal to her, except maybe financially. But she was able to, do a great deal there. And she didn't stop any of her other work. She continued right through, in her real career of industrial medicine. She wrote 2 books when she was there, and I think she had the time probably to do that in a way that she might not have otherwise. She wrote, I have to write it down because I always forget them, but I don't have them written. One is industrial medicine, and that is, industrial toxicology. That's still in print. If you go to Amazon, it still says Hamilton and Hardy, and I think it's edition 6 or something. But it's still her book. And the other one was Industrial Poisons in the United States is the other one. That was the first one that she wrote in 1925, and then in 1934 she wrote the second one, and continued to update it. So she was a very respected and appreciated teacher, and she was apparently an excellent speaker. So I think that part of her Harvard career was also very gratifying. But I think that Harvard served her well as far as the kind of connections that she could get to things from that status. I mean, there's no question that it was a bump in status for her. But I think, anyway, in 1935, she had a 3-year contract just renewed, and a new president came in to Harvard and decided he wanted everyone to retire at 66. She was going to be 66, so he just canceled the contract. And now I suppose you sue him, right? Or he would know better than to do that. He'd figure out some other way to do this. But she just accepted it, and it was really, the first letters that she writes are all about anxiety about finances, because she was always operating in kind of a shoestring. She ends up, by that time, 1935, the New Deal has arrived. Her friend Frances Perkins was Secretary of Labor, and so she found work pretty easily. But that was also the year that Jane Addams died. She found out in, I think, February that she wasn't going to be renewed, and then Jane Addams died in May. So it was really a tough year. It was a very difficult thing. And then, she was so worried about money, and she lived until she was 101. So at 66, she had a long way to go. I'm sure she would have been really appalled if she'd realized how much longer she was going to have to fund herself. She didn't know it, fortunately. But in any case, I wanted to tell you one story, though, about her, and I was just delighted when I found this about Alice Hamilton and her colleagues. This is early on, about 1923. Gerard Swope had just become the CEO of General Electric. And I just found this out too. They did a very elaborate study that's still used by political scientists and people. It's called the, just went right on my head. Anyway, but she, I think, was probably part of that. Anyway, Swope he was interested in the quality of life in General Electric. And so the Harvard professors knew that he was interested in kind of, the inspecting of his factories and whatever. And they were very excited, and they thought they might get $100,000, which was pretty big money in 1923. But they didn't say one word to Alice Hamilton, whose life work was inspecting, not a word. And she was furious about it, but she, as she often did, she kept her own counsel and didn't write to anybody or denounce them or anything. And when they talked to Gerard Swope, he said, "Oh no, I want Alice Hamilton to do this." Because what they didn't know was that Gerard Swope and Alice Hamilton had both been residents of Hull House back in the 1890s. And they bicycled up and down Lake Michigan shores. And I mean, he was one of her good friends. So it's really interesting. I always think about her that she didn't have much in the way of financial wherewithal, but she had social capital that just wouldn't quit. I mean, she knew everybody, and this is an example of it. And then the minute they realized that Gerard Swope thought highly of Alice Hamilton, all of a sudden they were just falling all over her. And so she wrote a letter to a friend, and she said, "Well, apparently the meek do inherit the earth." So that was a great story. But almost one of the things that she didn't do was to in any way abandon her other interests. And almost immediately that comes to the attention of Harvard. Alice Hamilton in 1919, she had quite the amazing year. 1919, first of all, let me say, was one of the most shattering years in American history. Where next fall, Jeff Coleman and I are going to do the Red Summer of 1919. But it was, it was the year of readjustment after the war. So you got that going on, and there are labor strikes everywhere, most of them unsuccessful. There was an anarchist, or maybe more than one anarchist, nail bombs, and the Attorney General's house almost got blown up. The anarchist and his bomb blew up a little off, he might have blown the chimney off the Roosevelt house, Franklin Roosevelt's house. I mean, American history could have been very different if the guy had been a better anarchist or the bomber than he was. But in any case, but it was terrifying. I mean, people were getting nail bombs, and the race riot of Chicago happened that year. And I mean, it was a very unstable year. At the end of the year, Attorney General Palmer does the Palmer raids and swoops up all these people he thinks are Bolsheviks because the Russian Revolution had happened during the war. And, it's just an extremely unstable year. She had gone, first she'd gone to her copper mines and that would have been enough for me for a year, but then she went to Europe, and they were reconvening from a gathering they had in 1915, Women's International Peace Gathering. And so they gathered again. They were hoping to gather near the writing of the treaty, which they thought would be written in a neutral country. But of course it wasn't. It's written in France. There's nothing neutral about the Treaty of Versailles. So, so they went to Geneva, and they ended up founding this permanent organization, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And then Herbert Hoover, who was at that point the person who was in charge of really feeding Europe, he was the quite brilliant bureaucrat who was organizing all of the relief efforts. He asked Adams and Hamilton if they would stay because he wanted them to accompany the Quakers into Germany with the food that they were hoping to get them. But until, I never knew this. Did you know this, Mike, that they starved the Germans into signing the Treaty of Versailles?
Yeah, I don't know a lot about it.
But
Yeah,
you know, I really, because she sees it. And Hoover was forbidden by the United States Congress from giving any food to Germany. But the Quakers were willing to purchase it, and he was eager to sell it to them. But he couldn't even do that until they had signed the treaty. You know, I think about that. People always talk about the bitterness of various things, and I think that they don't mention that, and that starvation. When they hung around Europe. I mean, they really didn't kind of hang around. They visited lots of different friends and things. They were having a hard time getting a visa, and finally, I guess the treaty was signed enough, or you know, there was enough agreement so that they were able to get into Germany. And she was horrified. The children were, you know, swollen bellies, and just what we see now when you see a country that's in the throes of famine. There were people dying of starvation, and they were so appalled by it. And you know, they both came home determined that they were going to, first of all, raise as much money as they could to try to feed the Germans. And you think about the difference between that and the Second World War, and that was something people learned from that First World War experience, that when you have a defeated country, you don't grind it into the dirt if you want any kind of a good result later. So they came home and they both tried to speak a lot about, you know, what was going on, just be witnesses to it. And one of the things, when she first went to Boston, she stayed at a women's hotel, and one of the women said to her, "I wish I could believe what you're telling me about the starving women and children, but I'm afraid it's too good to be true." So that was the way the mood had shifted from the, you know, it was never easy to be a social reformer, but the mood of the country had gotten so ugly. And so, pretty early on, I don't know, what is this, December of 1919, she'd gotten there in September, she was told by one of the Harvard board that one of their donors was going to stop giving money if Alice Hamilton did not stop talking about starvation in Germany. And so she did what I think she typically does. One of the things I'm interested in about her is that she's so diplomatic, and she really is able to persuade people. And what she did here was, again, she had a meeting with him, and she said to him, "I'll write to you about this." And so she writes to him. And this is what she writes. She says, "You will remember that I promised to think over very carefully the things you said to me last Monday and to write to you. Needless to say, I've thought a great deal about it. One does not take such a thing lightly. But I'm afraid I cannot write you what I know you wish to hear from me, that your statement of my relation to Harvard University and its bearing on my espousal of an unpopular cause has made me decide to drop all efforts to help the children of Germany. What I've said in public about Germany and the Germans is based on what I saw there last July. It was a pitiful, heartbreaking sight, and all that made it endurable was the thought that by seeing the misery with my own eyes, I should be able to tell people over here about it with more convincing force and perhaps induce some of them to help. I cannot bring myself to believe that this is something I ought to give up because of the prevailing feeling against Germany here in Boston. If the women who feel that German children should be left to their fate could actually see the little things, they would feel quite as much pity as I do. They could not help it. I think you will say that this is beside the point, that you had no desire to change my views, only to induce me to refrain from expressing them. But it would be quite impossible for me to enter into a relationship with any institution if by so doing it was necessary for me to detach myself from purely human problems and to take no questions which are of the deepest no part in questions which are of the deepest importance to me as a human being, not as a member of a faculty or a physician or anything that represents but one side of me. Up to now, this question has never arisen. This is the only sharp part of this letter. My chief in the government has always known of my attitude towards war. He knew of my object in going to Germany this summer, but nobody in the government has ever challenged my view, nor held that they rendered me less useful. For more than 2 years of the war, the government entrusted me with the investigations of all factories making explosives and airplanes, showing that they believed me not disloyal. I do very much regret that your work for the college should be made even a little bit more difficult because of me, but I'm afraid I cannot change. So that was the beginning. And later on, she refers to him somewhere in a letter as an old darling, so she managed to apparently get on with him later. But that was just the first, too. And in 1920, there was the beginning of what becomes one of the great causes of the 1920s, and that is that two Italian, they were anarchists, Sacco and Vanzetti, do anybody know those names, were arrested and charged with the murder of, the robbing of an armored truck and the murder of one of the guards. And the trial, many people felt, Alice Hamilton certainly did, that the trial was much more about their being Italian and being anarchist than it was about any kind of real attempt to prove that they were guilty. People still are arguing about whether or not Sacco and Vanzetti are guilty. I think it's pretty well agreed now that Vanzetti absolutely was not. There were eyewitnesses, they were Italian, but there were eyewitnesses putting him all, in far away from this. And the witness that fingered Sacco, or one of them, was at least 100 feet away. How far away was that from here right now? Anybody know? I'm not no good at that kind of thing. But
Well, it would be a third of a football field. So if you
okay,
imagine
so it
a
would be
football
farther
field,
than
it'd be farther than that wall.
maybe farther than the pillars. And this was in the dark, and she said she identified it from.
And weren't they wearing
from that.
masks too, like on the lower half of their face? I think they were wearing masks or something like that, I don't recall, or hats.
The
Something, I don't
people,
remember.
the
The murderers.
yeah. But the person who was the most notorious was the judge, Judge Webster Thayer, who was so determined that he was going to show, that he was laying down the law, that he would come into his club and they would describe people practically diving under tables to avoid him because he was such a bore about this. But he would refer to them openly as those anarchist bastards, he was really, and there were a number of, for our purpose, our view, weird things that prosecution did not have to give the defense all the information they had. So they actually had information saying that Vanzetti was innocent, and they didn't have to give it to them. And the other thing was that when you went for an appeal, the person who had to grant the appeal is the judge you're appealing against. Have you heard of that, Amanda? Yeah, that was baffling. But in any case, the trial was over, but then there were attempts at appeal that went on really for a considerable time until 1927. And she was very much involved with that. By this time, she had found kind of her own people in Boston. She roomed with a couple who were also very involved. And he was a physician, and the wife was very involved in social issues. And so one of the things she's involved in was the Sacco and Vanzetti case. The mayor of Harvard was part of a committee that was supposed to be studying, the justice of this trial, and they came down, on the side of guilty, basically, and supporting the judge in the trial. So here she is on the other side, I don't know whether she was ever rebuked for it, because there were so many people. I mean, the night that Sacco and Vanzetti were executed, Edna St. Vincent Millay, John Dos Passos, and I forget, Dorothy Parker were all arrested outside, picketing. So, I mean, it became the great cause. Mussolini, of all people, but because of the Italian connection. And the Pope spoke out against it. And, there were people all across the world who were demonstrating and, calling for their at least a commutation of the sentence. And Alice Hamilton ended up on a committee, again, the only woman, who were sent to the governor to ask for commutation of their sentence, or at least, life imprisonment, not the electric chair. But by that time, he was furious. He was angry at her friend Felix Frankfurter, who he thought was grandstanding and whatever, and she said it was just really very depressing and hopeless. So they, like everyone else, witnessed that, that execution, and it was a very, very, very bitter thing for them. She also, during the 1920s, although the United States did not sign the Treaty of Versailles and didn't join the League of Nations, she was the only woman on the Health Committee of the League of Nations, which was really interesting. And as part of that, she ended up going to the Soviet Union in 1924. This is during the first anti-communist, I mean, this is the Red Scare of the 1920s, and off she goes to the Soviet Union to inspect factories. She said their industrial health was really, she said it was better than their industry, actually, because they were still struggling along trying to establish industry, but she said they were really very conscious of health. And she found it pretty oppressive because Stalin by that time had taken over, and it was, you know, it was a fairly grim. She didn't even try to mail her letter until she got out of the Soviet Union. But she went all over Russia, and of course that would have been, you know, one of the other things I'm sure that disturbed the donors. I don't have any information about that, but I want to try to pursue that as well. So she really didn't in any way change the rest of her behavior. And the 1920s was a pretty thin time for all of them. I mean, there were these various, there's something called the spider network that people would put out, and it was all these people who were part of they were the Reds, basically. They were the socialists of this country. And she was one of them, and Jane Addams, and just about everybody she knew was on this, you know, spider web thing. So, but I don't think that never seemed to affect her ability to do her work. That Jane Addams, her friend Jane Addams, suffered really tremendously because her work was different. Her work was, you know, public speaking and things, and she was banished. She was excommunicated. Addams was, from the Daughters of the American Revolution. And, you know, there are all kinds of people who stopped giving money to her. In fact, in 1917, she was speaking out against the war, and a friend of Hull House, she thought a friend of hers, who was one of the Supreme Court justices of Illinois, stood up and announced that he would never give another penny to Hull House, and he would never speak to her again. So, I mean, it was a hard time for them. But they persisted. So. But in any case, that's I'm trying to think. I think that probably beyond going to Russia, that was the Sacco and Vanzetti thing was the most enduring struggle for them of that time. And then after 1936 or 35, when she leaves Harvard, she worked for the federal government, and then for a while she became the president of the Consumers League, and she continued until she was 85, I think, when she retired. She said, it's just really not decent anymore, she said. So she at that point decided to resign, and but she, I don't know very much about this, but it's one of the things I'm really interested in the 1950s, with the new Red Scare. She, you know, was very involved in trying to challenge that and speak out against it. And she became one of the 5 people who was allowed to write to Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who was one of the old-time labor leaders who'd been imprisoned, I think under the Smith Act. And she was sent off to federal prison as really a political prisoner. And she was not allowed to have any communication except from these 5 people. And Alice Hamilton was one of them. I don't think they saved the letters, though, sadly. So, but anyway, that's Alice Hamilton going to Harvard. So, do you have questions at all?
Any relationship, you know, since the Hull House to the University of Chicago?
Relationship with the
Yeah.
University of Chicago?
Yeah, in her work.
They had a very close relationship. Yeah. Are you thinking of University of Illinois of Chicago?
Yeah.
That's the one relationship. They destroyed their neighborhood and
Right.
you know, Mayor Daley kind of plunked the whole expressway system down right there, and it really did destroy that. By that time, by 1960, you know, that was a stable, very stable, long-time neighborhood. When they moved there in the 1889, it was a port of entry, and you got out of there as soon as you could, you know, but by 1960, it was really heartbreaking, because there were generations of people who had lived there and everything. And so sort of to make up for that, I guess, they put the University of Illinois at Chicago down there. But their relationship with the University of Chicago was ongoing during the whole of Hull House. I mean, even when the year Alice Hamilton came, they were running against their alderman, Johnny Powers, who was this really major power in Chicago. And this nice young man from the University of Chicago, who was a Hull House resident, ran against them and kept getting beaten up on the way to school and things. I mean, they were a pretty tough crowd. But they, you know, the sociologists from the University of Chicago were very involved with them. John Dewey used to come and lecture and talk to the Greek immigrants, talk about Plato to the Greek immigrants. And yeah, it was a
Really influenced by pragmatism.
Oh, right, yeah. And yeah, absolutely. And in fact, Jane Addams said about the First World War that knowing that John Dewey supported it almost changed her mind. She said if anything could have changed her mind.
Well, and the methodology, too, developed in the Chicago School of Sociology really sort of mirrors the kind of research that Jane Hamilton was doing in the community.
Right.
And I think, you know, they were working in conjunction together. But it's interesting because Alice Hamilton is a scientist.
Right,
you know,
she is.
and she's working with a different group, which doesn't necessarily adhere to pragmatism. You know, you think of that scientific community, you know, they're not coming out of a pragmatic scientific methodology or tradition. So maybe that was used to sort of shove her out because she had a different approach to science.
Shove
She
her out
was-
of where?
Of academia.
Well,
You
she
know,
wasn't
out of-
shoved
She
out.
wasn't shoved out, but she wasn't given positions of authority. And within the system of academia, you had to adhere, you know, to the dominant methodology of the time. And although she wasn't shoved out, although she had a very successful career, it'd be something to look at, you know, if there were any kind of debates going on about methodology. Because she really took a different approach to science. Her approach to science was, as you have maybe stated, through connecting with real human issues.
Yeah, it was, well, now Osler would have thought that was just fine, though. I mean, and he was the premier medical person, and he was all about, Jane Addams called that learning from life itself, you know, and he was as hands-on as you could possibly be. And so some of the people, like the people at Harvard, who thought that her work was a little, I think there's a real class element to it there. I think, you know, she worked with poor people. She talked to, that's who she cared about. And she went into dirty old factories and dangerous places, and it just wasn't quite genteel. The public health people, I don't think they were that happy about the entire school of public health. Just again, you know, because it's a class-based thing.
Does that sort of tie into her sort of ends justify the means with regards to like the studies of women in work? Like we were talking about in class, was it Mueller versus Oregon or something like that? Where it's the limits on how long women can work.
Protective legislation for women, right. In the 1920s, there was a real struggle between the Alice Paul wing of the suffragists, who were they wanted an equal rights amendment immediately. And some of their biggest opponents were other women who had also fought for suffrage, because they could see, even with the suffrage amendment passed, there were courts that were beginning to find against protective legislation. Well, you got the vote, you're equal. So they were and they had worked so hard for that protective legislation. And for her, that was always kind of the thin end of the wedge. I mean, it wasn't just, she was concerned about women and children, but in the end, what she wanted was some kind of legislation that protected all workers. And that, you know, by the end of the 1930s, that was what they had at least begun to achieve. They really, there's another one of these letters that she writes after having tea with somebody from the Alice Paul, the Women's Party, who was fiercely supportive of the Equal Rights Amendment, and Alice Paul writes to her and says, you know, you don't see the people that I see, these people who work in laundries, sometimes 80 hours a week, you know, and she says, you talk about freedom, but freedom is, you know, not anything that means anything in their lives, you know, the freedom to starve, the freedom to be exploited, you know, and she said, I know what is going to happen in those courts. I was telling you, she didn't like lawyers. She was, even though she had all kinds of friends who were lawyers, but she was absolutely a scientist, you know, and she really, and she felt that science was, she just trusted science in a way that she didn't. She thought law was clinging to old, absurd notions, so it annoyed her. She just had so many experiences with, when she was at Hull House, she did a lot of work with cocaine, and they would go into court and they'd try to get somebody convicted, and, you know, it just, partly the Chicago courts, I mean, it wasn't just lawyers, it was those particular courts, but yeah, there was a real tension between those two groups of women's rights people in the 1920s. And actually the labor unions and, I mean, Eleanor Roosevelt, Alice Hamilton finally comes out in favor of the Equal Rights Amendment. I can't remember the time. I think it's post 1949 though. And that the Women's Party is really thrilled when she does, because she's got real standing as somebody who knows so much about the workplace. And by that time she says, you know, we've got enough protection for everyone so that this isn't an issue anymore. But as long as it was a question of losing the few gains, and especially, you know, it was the 1920s and they were seeing everything they'd ever fought for just going down the drain. I mean, it must have been, I always think about that now and think, well, people have gone through this before, right? Bucked up and survived it.
Joan, I know you've written up some of your research. Where do you stand on that? Are you going to do a whole book or just articles, or what are you thinking?
I think I'm going to do a book, but I've never said it out loud before.
Yes, you did. Yeah,
Did I?
Yes, you did.
Okay, well then apparently I've said it before. Yeah, I think, you know what I don't want to do is, although I may end up doing it, but I just don't want to do a straight cradle to grave biography. I'd rather do it thematically. She just lends herself so much to thematic discussion. You know, she's so many different things, but I think I'm sort of needing to do that. I think this is my.
Yeah.
She was 74 when she wrote her Exploring the Dangerous Trades.
Following your hero.
Well, you've given us an outline, a very good outline. I should have recorded you. That would be your first draft.
Well, and I've been talking about it relentlessly. There's a really wonderful book written by Barbara Sischerman. It's not really written by her, it's Alice Hamilton's letters. And Barbara Sischerman is an emerita historian at Connecticut College. And she was called by one of the, I think, nephews, Hamilton nephews. By this time, none of the first generation were there anymore. And he said, we got a lot of letters from my aunts. And she said she went to this house and the entire table was just simply filled with these wonderful letters from the Hamilton women writing back and forth. And so her book is, it's called Alice Hamilton, A Life in Letters. And it's mostly the letters of Alice Hamilton. It's not all of them, but every time I pick that book up, I think, well, I don't have to do anything. She's done it. You know, it's just, I feel exhausted every time because I think it was such a good thing. But I don't, you know, it was done in the 1980s, and I don't know, you know, nobody's written anything since. I don't know why. I think she's just an amazing person. I think she's just extraordinary.
Is that book similar to the Jane Franklin book?
To the Jane,
Franklin?
the
The one we read?
The Life and Letters?
Yeah.
You mean? No, it's pretty different because it's mostly Alice Hamilton's. Oh, I see what you mean though, that it's really, no, she's written so much more, you know, that we're talking about the Joan book on Book of Ages on Benjamin Franklin's sister. And she manages to write a whole wonderful book with just
She's got like half a dozen
documents. But Alice Hamilton's problem is not a few documents. Let me tell you.
Multi-volume.
She also wrote, you know, as I said, extensively for The Atlantic and for Harper's and for, and about a lot of things too, not just her own field.
Well, your whole lecture is really orienting, I think, to a lot of contemporary debates that still remain.
Yeah, isn't it?
And I think you could write about her life with an eye to contemporary issues, and it'll be on the New York Times bestseller list. I'll buy it. No,
That's an incentive.
No, because it really stretches a period of history that is still playing out today, once again.
And she's, you know, the thing that I most admire about her is that she's just such a true soul. You know, she really, she's not an absolutist at all. I mean, she's very much, she's practical, she's pragmatic, I didn't bring this quote, but it's my favorite quote of hers, where she talks about, it's in 1919, and she says, I think that I would like to become a Quaker. You've read this book. And she says that what she respects about them is the absence of dogma in faith and the insistence of dogma in behavior. And then she says the resistance to authority is one of the things, but the recognition of the light, the light within, not only in yourself, but in other people. And it's just, to me, that is essentially, it's just the essential statement of who she is. And but you could, you could bring her in and she would be right, she'd be so current in her discussion. Not like, I guess because we haven't changed that much, or we're reverting or something. But anyway. But I think I'm going to try to do, I got to do something. So, I'm not sure what it's going to be. But I'm really fortunate that I have people who will listen to me and talk to me about it. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.